I just love French cuisine. One might even say that a lobster with a nice bechamel sauce is to die for. And usually, that would be a figure of speech. But not in today's story. So while I show you how to make a 17th century bechamel sauce drizzled over lobster tail, I'll tell you the story of one of history's most infamous food-related deaths from the court of King Louis XIV. This time on Tasting History. The court of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, produced some of the most amazing art in history. From the architecture to the literature and drama, and of course, the music. Some of my favorite composers come out of this time period. But perhaps the most important artistic leap came in the form of food. During this time, chefs and several cookbooks make extraordinary leaps to break away from the medieval and Renaissance cuisine, and they lay the groundwork for French haute cuisine as we know it today. One of the most important advances were sauces. Before this time, sauces tended to be highly spiced, vinegar-based, and thickened with breadcrumbs, which could leave a gritty, if not even lumpy sauce. But starting with books like La Varenne's Le Cuisinier Francois in 1651, we see the introduction of cream and fresh herbs, and probably most importantly, roux, which will allow for a nice, smooth sauce that we would recognize today. And today's sauce is one that you will probably recognize. It's one of the 5 mother sauces called Béchamel, or white sauce. The recipe I'm using is from the 1670 Les Dents du Commis by Francois Marin. Sauce à la Béchamel. Put in a pan 3 or 4 pieces of butter with a little parsley, scallions, chopped shallots, salt, crushed pepper, a little nutmeg, flour to bind the sauce. Wet with good cream. Turn on the fire to make it take on taste and consistency, and you use it as needed. So it sounds a lot like a modern-day bechamel, though it uses cream instead of milk, so it's going to be a lot thicker. And it has shallots and parsley already in there, which most modern bechamel would not have. Now, the major difference is in the order that things are added to the sauce. What's interesting is that earlier on in the book, he discusses at length how to make a roux and the importance of making roux, and then he doesn't use it in this recipe. And I wonder if that's on purpose. See, during this time period, cookbook writers were writing for a professional audience, and especially Marin, because he was a snob extraordinaire, did not want amateurs knowing how to make their food. You know, he's kind of protecting his livelihood. I don't have proof of that, but I think it's very likely, especially if you read the book in its entirety and see how he leaves different clues. So I am going to be reordering the recipe a little bit so that we get a nice bechamel. So what you'll need is 4.5 tablespoons or 60 grams of butter, 8 tablespoons or 60 grams of flour. Now if you use a little bit more flour, it's going to be a thicker sauce. You probably don't need that because we're using cream, but if you want a thinner sauce, then go ahead and use less flour. That's perfectly okay. 2 cups or 475 milliliters of cream, a bit of minced parsley, minced scallions, and minced shallots. Some salt, pepper, and nutmeg, all to taste. Now you'll note at the end of the recipe he says you use it as needed, but then he doesn't give us any actual uses for the sauce, really. Luckily, about 20 years earlier, La Varenne gives us several uses of what he calls sauce blanche. Some of the uses are for asparagus and fowl, and my favorite, langouste, or lobster. So I am going to be putting this on several lobster tails. So if you're going to make lobster, go ahead and cut the back down the middle, using kitchen shears, stopping at the tail. Then flip it over and crack the bottom side of the lobster to help you open up the shell. With your finger, gently but firmly separate the meat from the shell and push it up through the cut you made and let it rest on top. Remove the vein or any other pieces that are hanging off. Then brush a little melted butter on top of it to keep it from drying out, and set the lobster tails in a pan about 6 inches from the top of the oven and broil at the highest setting for about 5 to 7 minutes, or until the meat turns an opaque white. It's super easy. Now, the most important part of the dish, the sauce. So you don't have to cook the shallots ahead of time. It's unclear in the recipe. I did because I like the flavor of cooked shallots more than raw shallots, so I just put them into a small pan over medium-high heat with a little butter just to soften them up until they're translucent, and then I set them aside to cool. Now, for the base of the sauce, you want a large saucepan or even a pot. Set it over medium-low heat and add the butter. Once the butter is nearly melted, add in the flour and stir until everything comes together. Now again, the thickness of this roux is really up to you. You can add more or less butter or flour, but I like a nice thick roux, so it's almost like a paste. Regardless of how thick you want it, cook it for about 2 minutes to make sure that you get rid of that flour flavor. You don't want that in the sauce, it ain't gonna be good. Then add in 1/3 of your cream and whisk it vigorously to make sure that there are no lumps. Then add in the second third of cream and whisk again, and finally that last third until you have a nice consistent sauce. Then grate in your nutmeg. I used 1/2 of a whole nutmeg, which is about 1 teaspoon of grated nutmeg. Then add some salt and pepper and the parsley, scallions, and shallots. Now you're going to let this cook for probably 4 or 5 minutes to let it kind of thicken a little bit. Now if you find that it thickens just a little too much, go ahead and add a bit more cream. It's totally fine. There's no reason to stress. Sometimes sauces stress people out, but just relax and hit that like button, or else you might end up like poor Francois Vatel, which brings us to this. France under the reign of Louis XIV was like a culinary Silicon Valley. There was so much innovation and opportunity everywhere. So it's no wonder that Swiss-born Francois Vatel decided to study cooking. And his first big job was in the kitchens of Nicolas Fouquet, the king's own superintendent of finances. And he must have done very well there because in August of 1661, he was actually put in charge of the kitchens for the inauguration of Fouquet's new chateau at Vaux-le-Vicomte. Now this party goes down as one of the great fêtes in French history, and not just the food, but the entertainment as well. Molière premiered his comedic ballet Les Fâcheux at the party, with choreography by Pierre Beauchamp and music by Jean-Baptiste Lully. Also, the actual chateau itself and the gardens were said to rival Versailles. Now, King Louis himself came to this party, and a word to the wise, don't try to build a house that's better than your boss's, and if you do, don't invite him to the housewarming. See, Fouquet was already kind of on the rocks with his monarch, and if Louis hadn't been 22 and hadn't really developed much clout, he would have already gotten rid of Fouquet. But he was looking for absolutely any reason to do so, and this party ended up being just such a reason. After all, to have such a grand soirée and a grand house, you have to have grand finances. And so after the party, Louis had Fouquet arrested on suspicion of pecuniary improprieties and lèse-majesté, or insulting the king to the point of treason. Fouquet was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, putting our dear Vatel out of a job. But a few years afterward, another job presented itself when Louis de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, made Vatel his maître d'hôtel, or maître d', at the Château de Chantilly. And Vatel flourished there. He was in charge of absolutely everything, and other nobles would actually come visit the chateau not for the prince, but to be wowed by Vatel himself. He was actually given his own apartments and given the right to carry a sword, which was a great honor, and is foreshadowing. So a few years into his tenure with the prince, in April of 1671, a messenger arrived with a message from the king. It seemed that the king was going to be coming for a stay, and it was a very important visit because the prince and the king, who was his cousin, had kind of been in a rocky place for a while ever since the prince had challenged his cousin's authority during a series of civil wars known as the Fronde. Now the prince had apologized after he lost, but the two hadn't been that close ever since. So surely the prince impressed upon Vatel the importance of the occasion and that it really needed to go well. Now when the king came to visit, he didn't come alone. He came with an average of 400 to 600 nobles and courtiers and up to 2,000 servants. And Vatel had to make sure that they were all well fed and entertained. Oh, and the king would be here in 2 weeks, which when people couldn't go faster than horses, wasn't very much time. You can see why the man was probably stressed. Now, there are several sources that talk about what happened that weekend, but the best come from the letters of Madame de Sévigné, who was there the first night, where everything started off just splendidly. "I had intended to tell you that the king arrived yesterday evening at Chantilly. He hunted a stag by moonlight. The lanterns did wonders, and the entertainment went off admirably well." A triumph! Though she does mention that the fireworks, which cost 16,000 francs, were obscured a bit by some light fog, and those that could be seen were a little eclipsed by the brightness of our serene friend the moon. But one can hardly blame Vatel for that. Now, everything else she talks about is secondhand. Either she had already left, or she just wasn't privy to the actual goings-on. And the first thing that she talks about is something that happened at dinner that night. "A meal in a spot strewn with jonquils. Supper was served, but there was no roast meat at one or two of the tables, on account of Vatel's having been obliged to provide several dinners more than were expected. This affected his spirits, and he was heard to say several times, 'I have lost my honor, I cannot bear this disgrace.' He said to Gourville, 'My head is spinning, I have not had a wink of sleep these 12 nights.' Gourville mentioned it to the prince, who went directly to Vatel's apartment and said to him, 'Everything is extremely well conducted, Vatel. Nothing could be more admirable than His Majesty's supper.' Vatel replied, 'Your Highness's goodness overwhelms me. I am aware that there was a deficiency of roast meat at 2 tables.' 'Not at all,' said the prince. 'Do not fret. All will go well.' But all did not go well. See, the next day was Friday, and on Fridays it was forbidden to eat meat. And Vatel thought that local river fish were too pedestrian for the king, so he ordered seafood, like our lobster, from the ports of Normandy 150 kilometers away. So it's early Friday morning at 4 a.m., and Vatel is walking the halls on another night of little to no sleep, when the man who he had tasked with procuring the seafood arrives with only 2 small loads of fish. "Is this all?" Vatel said. "It is, sir," said the man, not knowing that Vatel had dispatched other people to all the seaports around. Vatel waited for some time. The other purveyors did not arrive. His head grew distracted. He thought there was no more fish to be had. He flew to Gourville. "Sir, I cannot outlive this disgrace." Gourville laughed at him. Vatel, however, went to his apartment, and setting the hilt of his sword against the door, after 2 ineffectual attempts, succeeded in the third in forcing his sword through his heart. At that instant, the carrier arrived with the fish. When the servants went upstairs to see what they were supposed to do with the fish, they found Vatel dead in a pool of his own blood. When the prince later told the king what had happened, the king showed quite a bit of remorse, saying that he understood how stressful his visits could be, and that in the future, the prince or anyone should only have to feed 2 tables and not worry about the rest. Now, if you read Madame de Sévigné's letters, and they are all wonderful, it's clear that she is very upset about what happened to Vatel. She knew him personally, and she held him in great esteem. But I do think it's somewhat callous, and, it's who she was in the time period, about how she ends one of her letters after telling the story of the man's suicide. "It must be very disagreeable to have so fatal an event break in upon an entertainment that cost 50,000 crowns. Now, in France, in the 17th century, if you committed suicide, you were not allowed to be buried in a cemetery or sacred ground. You often wouldn't be buried at all. But Vatel was held in such regard by his employer that only recently there was a record found at the nearby Église Saint-Firmin, which states, "On April 27, 1671, the body of Monsieur Vatel, of the house of the said prince, was brought in a coach belonging to the Prince of Condé, to be interned in the cemetery on orders of the gentleman of the prince, who also signed my discharge." And while some at the time chastised him for taking such dramatic action, others lauded him for his sense of duty. And it was that perception that persisted throughout French history, making him somewhat of an icon, in part due to the help of the famous French author Alexandre Dumas. In his 1847 novel, 10 Years Later, which is the last in the Three Musketeers trilogy, did not know that it was a trilogy, by the way, so now I really need to read that book in full, the character of Vatel is still working for his first boss, Fouquet. And after a particularly well-appointed round of drinks, Fouquet thanks Vatel and says that he's going to double his salary. and ever the proud one, Vatel says, "To be thanked for having done one's duty is humiliating." Interesting side fact, in real life, when Fouquet was arrested, the person who did the arresting was D'Artagnan from the Three Musketeers. Isn't that just crazy? There's also a legend from the 19th century that credits Vatel with inventing crème chantilly, or Chantilly cream, that weekend, because in addition to not having enough fish, I guess he also didn't have enough cream. So he ordered what cream there was to be whipped to increase its volume and make it look like there was more. Nice story on the one hand, and on the other hand, kind of a terrible story because it's just like adding to the misfortunes that this poor man had that weekend. Also, it's not true, because we know that there were flavored whipped creams long before Vatel, and crème chantilly wasn't a term used until much later, so not true at all. Regardless, to honor Monsieur Vatel, I suggest we plate up a dish that might have been served on that fateful day had he just held out a little bit longer. So once your bechamel sauce is the consistency that you want, or actually a little bit thinner because it is going to continue to thicken even after you take it off the fire, go ahead and serve it. And here we are, langouste à la sauce blanche, or lobster with bechamel sauce. Here we go. That's amazing. That is, you don't need the lobster. You don't need anything, just a spoon. Just hook it to my veins. Oh my gosh, that is fantastic. I mean, the lobster is wonderful. Don't get me wrong, love lobster, but the sauce. It's so creamy. I think I just had food fly out of my mouth. The flavors, you can just taste all of the different herbs and the nutmeg and the pepper really comes through. And I didn't use that much pepper, which is interesting. But wow. Oh, wow. That's going on everything. I am glad I made a lot of it. And it's low-cal, too. So, it's not. But it's wonderful. So I heartily endorse you making this dish. Just the sauce, honestly. I mean, the lobster is wonderful, but just make the sauce. It's easy, and it's fantastic. Yeah, I will see you next week on Tasting History.